And actually, the normal makes us feel like we always have to be something that we're not. So often we hear about body beauty norms. A lot of the conversation on Instagram is that we're taught that you have to be thin, you have to be light skinned, you have to remove your body hair. What those basically teach us is that's the new eugenics. We're taught that you don't have a fundamental worth. You have to become something in order to be worthy. And what eugenics basically indoctrinated white people into believing is that they were not enough. White people were basically gaslit by eugenics as would it be like, unless you're straight, monogamous, dress like this, act like this, make this kind of money, unless you practice this kind of religion, unless you do this, then you're not worthy. And so when I am blowing the whistle on eugenics, what I'm actually saying is that I'm trying to create a world where each and every person has a fundamental and intrinsic dignity and worth, and that you don't have to do or become in order to be worthy. And we're trying to remove a culture of shame that makes people feel like they have to become something that they're not in order to be conferred rights. How does this apply to contemporary trans rights? That's the sort of point that I was trying to make for people here. So what we see the Trump administration basically saying, and not just the Trump administration, we're seeing the governments in Hungary, in the UK, all across the world. They're basically being like, okay, these transgender people are choosing their genders, but biological sex is real. The minute that we hear any government say biology, I want like a ding, ding, ding to go off your head and be like, uh-oh, they're talking about eugenics. Because in the same ways in which heteronormativity masquerades under the language of normal, now eugenics is masquerading under the category of biological. Let me break it down for you. So people say to me, oh, look, there are so many biological differences between men and women. Babes, literally almost every single race, every single gender and sex is like 99% genetically the same. Like if you know anything about genetics, actually the most genetic diversity in the world is in Africa. But because of racism, we see black people and we're like, oh, they're all the same. No, actually, our skin tone is not a correlate for our genetic diversity. What eugenics does, essentially, is make us mistake people's physical appearance as a testament to their interior genetics. We don't know anything about genetics. Someone could literally look like the healthiest person in the world and not have the genes that we think that they do, okay? So what they're saying when they say biological differences between men and women is they're talking about perceived differences, because actually there are a billion biological differences within the category woman. If I was to randomly select two women in the world right now, actually these women would look totally different. One woman might be fat, one woman might be tall, one woman might be hairy, one woman might not have any muscle mass, one white woman might have a lot of muscle mass. That in fact, it's not that trans people are erasing biology, it's that trans people are not doing eugenics. That's the difference. Eugenics is based off of stereotypes that masquerade as biology. Transfeminism is based off of biological facts. And what the biological facts are is that there's more biological diversity within the category woman than between woman and man. And that in fact, people's anatomy is not their gender, it's people's energy that is their gender. I'll say that again. It's not people's anatomy that is their gender, it's people's energy that is their gender. The reason that anatomy becomes conflated with gender, becomes conflated with sex, is because the only way that we've been taught to understand gender and sex is through eugenics. And eugenics teaches us that sex is about population management, not about pleasure. So of course, when your one goal is building the population, you reduce people to their genital capacities, their configurations, in order to fit into heterosexual hieroglyphics. No, actually, we're trying to say sexuality, gender, and sex belong to you. They don't belong to the state. So when we see this administration saying biological sex, what they're actually concealing is these histories of eugenics. And then you see people say, well, biology is not bigotry. And then we respond, no, ma'am, actually, biology has been used in the service of bigotry forever. And this brings me to my point in Hitler's American Model. This book, literally, I cannot recommend it enough. I learned so much. Essentially, what James Whitman argues is that Hitler and the Nazi regime learned racial eugenics from the United States. that actually in the 1930s, they would send Nazi lawyers over to the United States to research race policies in the US. So they tried to study Jim Crow, they tried to study anti-miscegenation laws, they tried to study all of the immigration laws, because what they were interested was how the US created a legal stature that had Black and Native people not recognized for their personhood. Well, the way that they created those laws is eugenics. They would literally find a way to be like, well, these Black and Native people, the US was the first country in the world to have literacy tests for voting, okay? Literacy tests for voting. So they would make people go through literacy tests in order to vote. Who was literate? People who had access to schools. Who had access to schools? White, wealthy, property-owning people. Who didn't have access to schools? Formerly enslaved, formerly colonized people. Hello? And so they would always find ways to make it about people's aptitude, and the law would reflect that. And so essentially, Hitler and Nazi lawyers studied Jim Crow, racial eugenics, and what they said is, we want Germany to do what the US was unable to do. The US has established this precedent, and now we're gonna carry it on and realize it, okay? So you cannot sit here and tell me that you condemn the Holocaust, that you condemn the persecution of these histories, and that you believe in human rights, which is a formulation that emerged after World War II, when you don't want to talk about how actually this rhetoric of biological sex is part of the same constellation of eugenics. And it is abhorrent to me and unacceptable that we don't understand that the US was the exemplar of global white supremacy in the early 20th century. That every single white supremacist regime looked to the US and said, how did they get away with it? How did they get away with it? And they copied what they did and they implemented it all over. And the way that they got away with it was through racial eugenics, because racial eugenics gaslit us into thinking that it was our fault and not their design. Racial eugenics gaslit us into thinking that there were biological differences between sexes, classes, and race. There are no significant biological differences that can be used and abstracted at the level of policy between sexes, classes, and races, point blank. If you want to talk to me about biology, let's talk about biology. Let's talk about how there are men who give birth, who are biological men. Let's talk about how there are people who are neither men nor women who menstruate, who are biologically non-binary. Biological refers to living matter. I have a biological ear. I have a biological nose. I have a biological tooth. When you say biological, what you're meaning is fertility. You need to ask yourself, why is fertility more important to you than my vitality? Why is fertility and my capacity to reproduce more important to you than my energy? Why do you care about my body and not my soul? And that's one of the arguments I want to make before I close. We still have $106 left.